What happens when animators stop pretending cartoons are only for kids? You get movies so strange, provocative, disturbing, and fearless that some audiences still wonder how they were ever produced. Part 3 goes even deeper, from underground experiments to notorious cult classics that pushed adult animation far beyond normal limits. Some became controversial, and a few feel like movies that simply should not exist. If you enjoy forgotten, controversial movies like these, hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because the strangest titles are still coming. Number 20. The Haunted World of El Superbiasto, 2009. Nothing about this movie tries to behave like respectable animation. Instead, it throws horror movies, comic book exaggeration, monster cliches, wild comedy, and adult humor into the same blender and refuses to slow down. The story follows El Superbiasto, an arrogant masked celebrity adventurer who becomes tangled in a ridiculous supernatural plan involving the villainous Dr. Satan. His sister Susie X joins the chaos, and before long, the movie becomes a parade of monsters, bizarre locations, musical interruptions, and jokes aimed entirely at grown viewers. One of the most memorable stretches takes place when the characters move through a nightclub filled with supernatural creatures. Background details change constantly, visual jokes appear for only seconds, and the movie seems determined to make every corner of the screen more outrageous than the last. What makes it remarkable is that the film uses the bright visual language of Saturday morning cartoons while deliberately aiming at the opposite audience. That contrast is the joke. Everything looks cheerful and colorful, yet almost every idea behind those colors belongs to late-night cult cinema. Number 19. Achi and Sipak, 2006. Imagine a futuristic action cartoon created by people who looked at normal science fiction rules and decided they were far too sensible. That is basically the energy behind this wild South Korean animated film. Society has run out of traditional energy, so the government develops an extremely strange new system for producing fuel. Citizens are rewarded with addictive blue treats. An underground market appears, and two small-time criminals, named Achi and Sipak, become involved with a woman whose unusual situation makes her extremely valuable. The movie's famous chase sequences are where everything explodes creatively. Characters leap between vehicles, buildings collapse around them, armies of bizarre creatures appear, and the animation suddenly becomes surprisingly elaborate. The action is exaggerated almost to the level of a video game. Underneath all that madness is a sharp parody of consumerism, government control, addiction, and corporate power. It may look ridiculous, but the world is built around people being controlled through rewards and consumption. That mixture explains why the movie developed such a strange cult reputation. It is crude, fast, colorful, and completely uninterested in being tasteful. If you're already wondering how much stranger animated movies can become, subscribe now, because we're barely getting started. And share this video with someone who still thinks animation always means family entertainment. Number 18. The Spine of Night, 2021. At first glance, this movie looks like something discovered on an old fantasy VHS tape. Its rotoscoped movement feels deliberately strange, while its painted backgrounds resemble artwork from forgotten pulp novels. The story revolves around a mysterious blue flower containing almost unimaginable power. Across different generations, rulers, warriors, scholars, and ordinary people attempt to control that power, usually with disastrous consequences. Rather than following one simple hero, the film jumps across time and shows how ambition repeatedly corrupts those who believe they deserve absolute control. A particularly striking sequence involves an attack on a fortified settlement. Instead of making the battle heroic, the filmmakers turn it into a nightmare of strange creatures, desperate fighters, and surreal magic. The handmade movement gives everything an uncomfortable physical quality. What separates the film from ordinary fantasy animation is its complete refusal to soften its world. Magic is dangerous. Heroes can fail. Powerful people behave terribly. Victory rarely feels clean. It is basically the kind of dark fantasy that animation studios almost never finance anymore, which makes its existence feel both surprising and strangely refreshing. Number 17. Mad God, 2021. For decades, visual effects legend Phil Tippett quietly built a nightmare one miniature at a time. The result feels less like a conventional movie and more like someone opened a door into another dimension and forgot to close it. The story follows a masked figure known as the Assassin as he descends through an enormous ruined world. There is very little traditional dialogue. Instead, the audience learns through environments. Factories filled with strange workers, gigantic machines, ruined civilizations, mysterious creatures, and landscapes that appear to have survived thousands of years of destruction. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment comes during the assassin's descent through the underground world. Each level reveals something even more bizarre than the previous one. Tiny workers perform meaningless tasks, while enormous forces operate above them, creating the feeling that everyone is trapped inside a machine they cannot understand. Because Tippett relied heavily on stop-motion miniatures, the world has real texture. Dust looks like dust. Metal feels heavy. Creatures seem physically present. It is challenging, bleak, and intentionally uncomfortable. But that is exactly why Mad God became such an important modern example of adult animation without compromise. Number 16. Seoul Station, 2016. Before Train to Busan turned a speeding train into one of modern cinema's most famous survival stories, director Yun Sang-ho explored the beginning of the same catastrophe through animation. The film begins around Seoul Station, where an apparently sick homeless man is largely ignored. His condition quickly spreads, and ordinary streets become overwhelmed. At the center of the story is a young woman named Hye-sun, separated from the people around her and desperately trying to move through the collapsing city. One of the strongest sequences follows survivors attempting to cross urban streets while panic spreads from one block to another. The animation allows the camera to show enormous crowds and sudden changes in direction, without making the action feel polished or heroic. But the infected are not really the film's only threat. Seoul Station is also interested in poverty, social class, exploitation, and the way vulnerable people can become invisible until their problems affect everyone else. That makes the movie more uncomfortable than a normal monster story. The city was already divided before anything went wrong. The disaster simply removes the polite surface hiding those divisions. Number 15. The King of Pigs, 2011. There are animated movies designed to help viewers escape reality. The King of Pigs does almost the exact opposite. After years apart, two former classmates reconnect and begin remembering the school they once attended. Their memories reveal a brutal social hierarchy in which wealthy, powerful students dominated weaker classmates. Into that environment came another boy, Kim Chul, who appeared willing to challenge the system. The most memorable scenes are not huge action sequences. They are uncomfortable classroom moments where small gestures suddenly reveal who has power and who does not. A look from one student can silence an entire room. Teachers notice certain things while apparently ignoring others. As the characters remember more, their nostalgia disappears. Childhood becomes something darker, a place where humiliation and fear helped shape the adults they eventually became. Director Yun Sang-ho later became internationally famous, but this early film already showed his fascination with social systems breaking down. The King of Pigs proves animation can explore psychological damage with a directness that live action sometimes avoids. Nobody receives a magical solution, and adulthood does not erase what happened years earlier. Number 14. Felidae, 1994. A talking cat cartoon normally sounds like the safest entertainment imaginable. Felidae clearly never received that message. The German animated mystery follows Francis, an intelligent cat who moves into a new neighborhood with his owner. Soon he discovers that several local cats have mysteriously died. Instead of running away, Francis begins investigating, gradually uncovering secret meetings, scientific experiments, and a disturbing history connected to the area. One scene became especially famous among viewers who discovered the movie without knowing what they were watching. Francis experiences a surreal nightmare in which familiar religious and scientific imagery transforms into something deeply unsettling. The animation suddenly shifts from detective story to pure psychological horror. Yet the mystery itself remains surprisingly serious. Francis interviews other cats, follows evidence, questions suspects, and slowly realizes that somebody is attempting to control the future of their species. That is what makes Felidae so strange. Visually, it resembles the kind of European animated feature parents might casually rent for children. Narratively, it behaves like a grim detective thriller. Many unsuspecting viewers learned the difference the hard way. Number 13. Perfect Blue, 1997. Few animated films have blurred performance and reality as effectively as Satoshi Kon's Perfect Blue. Mima begins the story as a successful member of a pop group, but decides to leave music behind and pursue acting. Her new career requires her to transform her public image, something that not every fan accepts. Soon, an obsessive website appears to describe her daily life with frightening accuracy, and Mima begins questioning, which memories are real. One of the movie's most famous techniques involves transitions. Mima opens a door in one location and suddenly appears somewhere completely different. A conversation turns out to be a television scene. A memory becomes a rehearsal. By the middle of the film, even the audience is no longer certain what actually happened. That confusion is deliberate. Perfect Blue examines celebrity culture, public ownership of famous people, and the pressure performers face when audiences refuse to let them change. The movie was released before modern social media existed, yet its ideas feel even more relevant today. Fans tracking every movement, invented online identities, manufactured personalities, and strangers believing they personally know a celebrity are now everyday realities. That may be the most disturbing part of Perfect Blue. The future eventually caught up with it. Number 12. When the Wind Blows, 1986. Nothing prepares viewers for this movie better than understanding its central trick. It looks gentle. Jim and Hilda Bloggs are an elderly British couple living quietly in the countryside. When international tensions suggest a major attack may happen, Jim follows government survival instructions and builds a makeshift shelter inside their home. Both remain convinced that authorities know what they are doing. Then the attack happens. One of the film's most unforgettable moments comes afterward, when the couple calmly emerge and attempt to resume ordinary life. They clean the house, prepare food, discuss government advice, and reassure one another that everything should soon return to normal. It does not. The simple, almost storybook animation makes their optimism increasingly painful. Instead of turning the catastrophe into action spectacle, the film remains inside their tiny domestic world. What happens to Jim and Hilda is gradual, quiet, and devastating. They do not fully understand what is changing around them. When the Wind Blows demonstrates why adult animation does not need outrageous comedy or extreme visuals to become difficult viewing. Sometimes two innocent characters trying to make tea can be far more disturbing. Number 11. The Plague Dogs, 1982. Anyone who remembers Watership Down as emotionally difficult should know that director Martin Rosen went somewhere even darker with The Plague Dogs. Two dogs, Ralph and Snitter, escape from a research laboratory in northern England. After experiencing harsh treatment, they suddenly find themselves outside with no idea how ordinary life works anymore. Their freedom quickly becomes another problem because they cannot easily find food or shelter. A fox eventually becomes their unlikely guide, teaching them how to survive in the countryside. But rumors spread that the escaped animals may be dangerous, turning frightened communities and authorities against them. One of the movie's most powerful moments involves Snitter explaining his confused memories. Because of what happened before the escape, he struggles to separate the present from fragments of the past. The animation makes his confusion strangely intimate. The film refuses to transform the dogs into cute comic characters. They behave like frightened animals trying to survive conditions they do not understand. By the final act, hope becomes painfully uncertain. The Plague Dogs is beautiful, intelligent, and deeply upsetting, which is exactly why generations of viewers remember accidentally discovering it far more clearly than many cheerful cartoons from the same era. Number 10. Heavy Metal, 1981. There may be no better example of a movie announcing immediately that it was created for older viewers. Heavy Metal is not one continuous story. Instead, several science fiction and fantasy adventures are connected by the Lochnar, a mysterious glowing object described as a source of corruption. Each segment introduces a completely different world, visual style, and group of characters. The opening sequence became legendary. A sports car drops from a spacecraft toward Earth, while loud rock music plays, instantly establishing that this is not traditional studio animation. From there, the film moves through futuristic cities, alien landscapes, fantasy kingdoms, strange spacecraft, and bizarre alternate realities. One famous section follows taxi driver Harry Canyon through a dirty future version of New York. Another tells the story of Tararna, a silent warrior whose arrival became one of the movie's defining images. What made Heavy Metal controversial was not simply its mature material. It was the combination of polished animation with ideas mainstream studios usually avoided. The soundtrack also became part of its identity, featuring major rock acts and giving the entire project the feeling of an animated midnight movie. For some viewers, it is messy and excessive. For others, that excess is exactly what makes it unforgettable. Number 9. Hey Good Lookin', 1982. Ralph Bakshi spent much of his career challenging the idea that American animation needed to remain polite and Hey Good Lookin' might be one of his strangest experiments. Set largely during the 1950s, the story revolves around Vinny, the leader of a Brooklyn street gang called the Stompers. His friend Crazy Shapiro follows him through neighborhood rivalries, romance, arguments, and increasingly dangerous confrontations. But the film is not simply a nostalgic gang story. Bakshi repeatedly breaks reality. Garbage cans talk. Objects behave like characters. Memories become exaggerated visual fantasies. Scenes sometimes feel less like objective events and more like distorted recollections being replayed decades later. One of the movie's most memorable sequences takes place during a confrontation between rival groups. Instead of staging everything realistically, Bakshi turns the environment into an emotional storm of movement, color, shouting, and surreal imagery. The film also had an unusually complicated production history. Early versions combined live-action material with animation before the project evolved significantly. That troubled development is visible in the final movie, which can feel uneven and unpredictable. Yet those imperfections also make Hey Good Lookin' fascinating. It represents a period when filmmakers were seriously asking whether American animation could become a medium for messy adult memories rather than simply another branch of children's entertainment. Number 8. Coonskin, 1975. Even among Ralph Bakshi's controversial films, this one remains difficult to discuss without understanding what it was trying to do. The story follows Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear, and Preacher Fox as they leave the rural South and enter Harlem. From there, the movie becomes an angry satire involving organized crime, corrupt institutions, racial stereotypes, entertainment culture, and the American obsession with power. Instead of avoiding offensive historical imagery, Bakshi deliberately exaggerates it and attempts to turn those stereotypes against the culture that created them. That strategy produced enormous controversy. One of the strongest sequences shows familiar cartoon imagery transforming into something threatening. Characters that initially resemble exaggerated comedy figures suddenly occupy a world filled with manipulation and violence. The effect is intentionally uncomfortable. The film also moves between live-action framing scenes and animation. That structure constantly reminds viewers that the cartoon world is connected to real social tensions, rather than existing in a fantasy vacuum. Public reaction became part of the movie's history. Demonstrations and accusations surrounding the film complicated its release and damaged its commercial prospects. Decades later, arguments continue over whether its satire succeeds or simply becomes overwhelmed by the imagery it attempts to criticize. Whatever conclusion viewers reach, Coonskin demonstrates how dangerous satire becomes when filmmakers use offensive symbols to attack the very stereotypes those symbols represent. It is not comfortable entertainment, and it was never intended to be. Number 7. Tarzan, Shame of the Jungle, 1975. Some parody movies gently tease their inspiration. This animated production practically launches itself at the entire adventure genre. Created by Belgian filmmakers Picha and Boris Schulzinger, the story follows Shame, an extremely incompetent jungle hero clearly inspired by Tarzan. His partner June is taken away, forcing Shame to begin an absurd rescue mission. That basic plot becomes an excuse for non-stop parody. Instead of noble jungle animals and heroic exploration, the filmmakers fill their world with strange creatures, foolish characters, ridiculous dangers, and jokes intended exclusively for adults. Every famous jungle adventure convention is twisted into something embarrassing. One memorable section sends Shame through a landscape where nearly every creature behaves in a way completely opposite to what audiences expect from traditional animation. The hero himself frequently seems less capable than the characters he is supposed to rescue. The movie also became involved in a legal dispute over its original title and obvious resemblance to the Tarzan property. In some markets, it appeared under alternative titles. English-language versions later attracted recognizable comedy performers, which helped increase its cult reputation. What really makes the film feel impossible today is its complete lack of concern about appearing respectable. Modern animated parody usually comes with carefully designed demographics and marketing strategies. Tarzan feels like the filmmakers simply asked, "How far can we push this joke?" and then never stopped. Even its roughness becomes part of the appeal. Backgrounds can look intentionally ugly, characters are grotesque, and heroic adventure is repeatedly reduced to ridiculous failure. It may not be sophisticated in the traditional sense, but as a strange artifact of 1970s adult animation, very little else resembles it. Number 6. Once Upon a Girl, 1976. Long before modern studios began creating ironic fairy tale movies, somebody had already decided to reinterpret familiar children's stories for a completely adult audience. Once Upon a Girl uses a framing story involving Mother Goose and then begins twisting recognizable fairy tales into increasingly outrageous versions. Classic characters appear, but their personalities and situations bear little resemblance to the innocent stories most viewers heard growing up. The animation deliberately imitates the look of traditional storybooks. That is exactly why the movie feels so strange. Soft colors, castles, forests, princesses, and fairy tale imagery create an expectation of childhood innocence, while the actual jokes are aimed squarely at grown viewers. Several sequences work by allowing the audience to recognize a famous story before suddenly changing its direction. Cinderella-like situations, royal characters, and familiar folklore are treated as opportunities for parody rather than moral lessons. By modern standards, the animation itself is limited. Movement can be simple, backgrounds repeat, and the production never tries to compete with expensive theatrical cartoons. But visual sophistication was never the main attraction. The real selling point was the shock of seeing supposedly innocent cultural material transformed into adult comedy. That idea may seem less surprising today because parody has invaded almost every famous franchise imaginable. In 1976, however, theatrical animation was still strongly associated with family audiences. A project like this, therefore, felt almost rebellious simply by existing. It also belongs to a forgotten era when independent producers could release unusual animated features into theaters without needing to satisfy the branding expectations of a giant entertainment company. The result is crude, bizarre, historically interesting, and definitely not the fairy tale Grandma remembered. Number 5. Dirty Duck, 1974. The title already warns you that normal cartoon rules are about to disappear. Also released under the name Down and Dirty Duck, this independent animated film emerged during the brief period when American filmmakers were experimenting aggressively with adult theatrical cartoons. The story follows Willard, a painfully ordinary office worker whose life changes after he encounters a bizarre talking duck. That creature becomes a kind of chaotic guide, pushing Willard away from his boring routine and into a surreal world where almost nothing follows ordinary logic. Rather than building a traditional plot, the movie often behaves like an animated hallucination. Scenes change suddenly, characters transform, reality bends, social rules disappear. One famous stretch begins in an apparently recognizable city environment, before gradually becoming a parade of distorted figures and visual jokes. The further Willard travels, the less certain the audience becomes about whether anything happening should be taken literally. That loose structure was closely connected to the underground comic culture surrounding adult animation during the period. Artists were not trying to create another Disney. They were trying to discover what cartoons could become if they were disconnected from children's entertainment completely. Musician and performer Mark Volman provided Willard's voice, while the soundtrack became another important part of the movie's countercultural atmosphere. The strangest element is probably the duck himself. He is not presented as a lovable mascot or comic sidekick. Instead, he behaves like an unpredictable force, pulling the protagonist deeper into chaos. Watching it today feels like discovering an artifact from an alternate version of Hollywood where adult animation became a major mainstream movement. That future never really arrived. Instead, Dirty Duck remained an odd cult object, too strange for ordinary audiences, too unconventional for major studios, and exactly strange enough to survive in movie history. Number 4. The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, 1974. How do you continue one of the most controversial animated movies ever released? Apparently, you make the main character older, more miserable, and trapped in a life he desperately wants to escape. The sequel finds Fritz married, frustrated, unemployed, and caring for a child. Rather than facing reality, he disappears into a series of fantasies in which alternative versions of his life unfold. That structure gives the movie permission to jump between wildly different scenarios. In one fantasy, Fritz imagines himself becoming enormously wealthy. In another, politics and social conflict become exaggerated cartoon nightmares. Other sequences push him through bizarre versions of American culture, where everything appears slightly more insane than normal. The most interesting difference between this movie and the original is the mood. The first Fritz followed a young character chasing excitement through counterculture America. The sequel looks at what happens when rebellion becomes adulthood. Fritz talks like somebody who once believed he would escape conventional society. only to discover that rent, relationships, responsibilities, and disappointment eventually found him anyway. Creator Robert Crumb had already distanced himself from the screen version of his famous character, and director Ralph Bakshi did not return for this sequel either. That makes The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat feel almost like an unauthorized continuation of a cultural phenomenon. Visually, it retains the rough underground comic atmosphere associated with the earlier movie, but the storytelling becomes more episodic. Some segments function like political satire. Others feel like personal fantasies. A few are simply designed to provoke. Its reputation never reached the level of the original, yet that may actually make the sequel more interesting for animation historians. Here was a studio attempting to prove that adult animation could become a repeatable theatrical business. Number 3. Heavy Traffic, 1973. After shocking audiences with Fritz the Cat, Ralph Bakshi followed it with something even more personal and visually aggressive. Heavy Traffic centers on Michael Corleone, not the famous gangster, but a young cartoonist living in a chaotic New York household. His Italian-American father and Jewish mother constantly argue, while Michael escapes into drawings and fantasies. The movie moves between animated scenes and occasional live-action imagery, creating the feeling that Michael's drawings are bleeding into reality. New York itself becomes a character. Apartment buildings lean over crowded streets. Bars overflow with exaggerated personalities. Criminals, hustlers, dreamers, and desperate workers move through neighborhoods that look simultaneously realistic and completely distorted. One of the movie's most memorable sequences revolves around a pinball machine. Bakshi repeatedly uses pinball imagery as a metaphor for city life. People bounce from situation to situation, pushed by forces beyond their control, hoping they can survive long enough to reach somewhere safer. Michael eventually becomes involved with Carol, a young woman who wants something better than the environment surrounding them. Their relationship gives the film an emotional center beneath the grotesque comedy. But Heavy Traffic refuses to become a simple romance. Every attempt to escape is complicated by family pressure, prejudice, poverty, crime, or random bad luck. The animation style reflects that instability. Beautifully painted backgrounds can suddenly be invaded by deliberately ugly caricatures. Real photographs appear behind cartoons. Characters stretch, distort, and sometimes seem to melt into their environment. The film received an X rating in the United States during its original release, placing it firmly inside the tiny group of mainstream American animated features, officially marketed only to adults. Number 2. Belladonna of Sadness, 1973. There are animated movies that look unusual. Then there is Belladonna of Sadness, a film that sometimes seems less like cinema and more like an illustrated art book suddenly coming alive. Produced in Japan and directed by Eiichi Yamamoto, the story follows Jean, a young woman living in a medieval village with her husband Jean. After powerful people abuse their authority, Jean becomes increasingly isolated. A mysterious supernatural presence then offers her power. What follows is not presented through conventional animation. Large sections use detailed watercolor paintings, slow camera movements across still illustrations, sudden explosions of color, and psychedelic transformations. Characters may barely move for minutes before the entire screen erupts into fluid imagery. That limited motion was partly connected to production realities, but it ultimately created the movie's unique identity. One of its most famous sequences transforms Jean's growing influence into an enormous stream of abstract shapes, flowers, patterns, and symbolic imagery. Instead of explaining her transformation literally, the film turns emotion into color. The result looks like medieval European artwork colliding with 1970s psychedelic design. The movie was the final installment in the Animorama trilogy, produced by Mushi Production, the studio founded by legendary manga artist Osamu Tezuka. Those films were attempts to prove Japanese animation could target adults through theatrical storytelling rather than children's television. Financially, Belladonna did not become the breakthrough its creators hoped for. For years, it remained relatively obscure outside dedicated animation circles. But restoration and international re-releases eventually introduced new audiences to its extraordinary visual style. Today, many viewers approach the film as an experimental work rather than simply a provocative cartoon. That distinction matters. Its difficult material is connected to themes of power, oppression, revenge, social fear, and the way communities punish people who challenge authority. The ending also connects Jean's image to a much larger historical idea of rebellion. Whether viewers find it beautiful, excessive, troubling, or all three at once, Belladonna of Sadness is almost impossible to confuse with anything else. And considering how financially risky and visually unconventional it was, the fact that a movie this strange received a full theatrical production in 1973 remains astonishing. Number 1. Fritz the Cat, 1972. Before Fritz the Cat, mainstream American audiences largely understood theatrical animation through one basic rule: cartoons were supposed to be safe. Ralph Bakshi shattered that assumption. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comic character, the movie follows Fritz, a college-age cat, drifting through a wildly exaggerated version of late 1960s New York. He begins as a restless student, more interested in appearing sophisticated than actually understanding the world around him. Soon he abandons university life and wanders through parties, bars, political gatherings, city streets, and counterculture environments. Every new location allows Bakshi to attack another piece of American society. Students pretending to be revolutionaries are mocked. Authority figures become grotesque caricatures. Political activists can appear just as ridiculous as the establishment they claim to oppose. Even Fritz himself is hardly heroic. He repeatedly believes he understands situations that are clearly much larger than him. One famous sequence begins with Fritz and several friends discussing poetry and philosophy at a party. What starts as a relaxed gathering gradually becomes increasingly chaotic until authority arrives and everything spirals out of control. Another major section sends Fritz into Harlem, where his desire to appear politically important helps create consequences he never properly understands. Bakshi combines comedy with anger throughout the film. Characters sometimes speak over one another. Street scenes contain details that have little to do with the main plot but make the city feel alive. The animation is deliberately rougher than traditional studio cartoons, which actually works in the movie's favor. Fritz's world is supposed to feel dirty, crowded, unpredictable, and slightly dangerous. Then came the rating. Fritz the Cat became the first animated feature to receive an X rating from the Motion Picture Association of America. That single fact changed the conversation around animation. Suddenly, a cartoon was being advertised to adults, not because children might find it boring, but because the material was intentionally created for mature viewers. The controversy helped. Audiences wanted to know what an X-rated cartoon even looked like. The movie became a major financial success relative to its small production budget, and proved there was at least some theatrical market for animated films aimed completely at adults. Its creator, Robert Crumb, famously disliked the adaptation and objected strongly to Bakshi's interpretation of Fritz. From psychedelic nightmares to talking cats and apocalyptic cartoons, these movies proved that animation has never belonged to one age group. Some pushed artistic boundaries, some created controversy, and others simply left audiences asking, "Who approved this?" If you enjoyed Part 3, hit like, subscribe, and tell us which bizarre animation deserves a place in Part 4. Because believe it or not, we still haven't reached the bottom of this animated rabbit hole.